Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Citizen Voice Online. We are going to be referring back to our history lesson today. Last week, if you recall, we had Stephanie Mann on, and we were talking about Jamestown and the kids and how families were secondary initially. They came later, but if you recall the previous lecture that I was trying, basically not a lecture, just a presentation, but trying to explain about how Europe was a mess at this point in time. And there was great turmoil in Europe, not only religiously, because there was the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics, but also politically as well. We know that there was great tension between Spain and England, primarily intermingled with that was that you have the royal family of Spain marrying off their daughter to King Henry VIII, and all the political intrigue that came out of that led to turmoil in Europe too. So this is one of the reasons. Old Europe was a place that was filled with a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos, a lot of warfare, and people, in many ways, they just wanted to get out of there if they could. And so that's one of the things that drove a lot of people to Jamestown initially, and then to the Massachusetts colony, and then the Dutch came and settled in New Amsterdam. The French came over. So there was a lot of different exploration going on, as I said, for the nations that had the wherewithal. But the exploration of North America by the British, it was basically set up by the Virginia Company, which is essentially it was an entrepreneurial adventure, and essentially money driven, wanting to make money, wanting to invest in the New World. So they were looking for gold like the Spanish. They were looking for land to claim land. They were clearing the land and then claiming it. You can see this picture that we showed before where they had to clear the trees and then they had to build the fort. So the fortress was essentially one of the first things. And one of the things that the Virginia Company knew, and they didn't really have adequate plans for everything. Uh, in many ways, it was an adventure or a venture capitalism. So they didn't know everything that they needed to do. And so setting up the fort, they knew that they were going to have a fort to protect the people who were eventually going to settle in Jamestown. So Jamestown, there was the river for trading because they were going to use that as a port city and then send that merchandise the crops that they grew in Jamestown back to the old country and start trading there. This this sign here, I want to call attention. It's called survival strategy. This became necessary because they found themselves in a situation. Many of the settlers had no idea what to expect, so they just struck out. Many of them were indentured servants. In other words, they signed up for 7 years and ultimately thinking that they would get a plot of land or they would get some recompensation for the efforts that they put in. So you're looking at 1607 is the founding of this colony. Yet within a year, there was a problem. These people, many of them, they didn't want to work, and the crops that they planted didn't necessarily grow. They needed the help of the Indians to make this thing work. And the unfortunate reality, as I mentioned in earlier episodes, is that some of the people didn't want to work. Some of the people had more of an aristocratic air, and they didn't feel that working was suitable for them. So it was beneath their dignity to go and work. And so they, some of them had the attitude that the Indians could be enslaved, like the Spaniards had enslaved the Indians before. So you have this political intrigue that's coming out of Europe and is being transplanted into the New World, so to speak. It wasn't really a new world. It was a world that was inhabited by people who had a completely different culture. So it became a survival effort. Many of the people became very clearly aware that the Virginia Company did not have all the answers. One of the things that I wanted to make people aware of is that we know a lot about John Smith, and we're going to talk about John Smith today more clearly, focusing in on John Smith. But from the Canary Islands, coming across the Atlantic Ocean, John Smith was a prisoner. The political intrigue there was they didn't like the so-called supposed leaders. No one knew who the real leader of this venture was going to be, because the Virginia Company sealed it in a box who the leaders were going to be. And then they told them not to open it until they got to the colony, until they got to the area where they would settle. So John Smith was actually arrested and he was detained. And ultimately, when they opened up the box, John Smith is one of the guys who's supposed to be on the ruling council. And so they didn't want to let him go. They didn't want him on the council. They were trying to get rid of him. But the minister, Reverend Hunt, persuaded them to keep him, out of chains and, out of, being arrested and being able to have some degree of capability on the council. So what they did is they kind of put John Smith in charge of keeping the colony alive, which was probably one of the wisest things that they did. He was actually a guy who was a great organizer, and he organized small teams, people to build the houses, people to do the farming, all these different things he set up as projects. And one of the amazing things, about Captain Smith that you read, I have his journals here. And in this book, it talks about Smith as being a true leader. And I think that these other men who were part of the council, they felt intimidated by John Smith. But he was a true leader. And one of the things that it says in his journals, and it was somebody else who was writing these, that he actually made sure that everybody had a house before he had a house. He was that kind of person. He really wanted to make sure that the colony would survive. Now, many people speculate as to why. Many people think that, he was just after wealth or whatever. But the ultimate situation is that his character was a character of a true leader. So the bottom line is that when we look at John Smith, he merged into that role. Now, the thing is that he would leave the Jamestown area and he would travel because he knew that the colony was going to depend on trade with the Indians. And the Virginia Company knew that. They understood that. So, they had to make it possible for the Indians to be able to trade with the colonists. And I don't know if they really worked it out, but John Smith became very useful because he was very quick at picking up the Powhatan language. And so he would do the traveling. He would go up the James River, and you can see one of these maps here. We have a map of this area where he would travel up the Chesapeake area, into this area, into the local areas where the Indians lived, right into their villages. And one of the early episodes is explained. He went out on a trade mission to try and trade with the Indians. and they were scoffing at him. They saw that the people were not working. They were, many were dying. And Smith shot off a few rounds. And the Indians got pretty serious. He shot off a couple limbs of trees, and the Indians became very serious. And so they began to, trade with him. But they also, I think, when word got back to the chieftains, they began to become suspicious, and also they felt that Smith was a dangerous man. So on one of these voyages, a very distant voyage up the Chesapeake, Smith took a few men with him. He had one Indian guide with him, and the ultimate situation is that the Indians killed the people that were guarding the canoe that he had taken up the river, or the sloop, and then they had proceeded a little further because the water would not allow them to go any further, the depth of the water. So what happened is that Smith left James Fort on a number of occasions. And I'm going to show you the inside of this fort here. They actually had cannon there. Eventually, they didn't initially, but they had to have people who were protecting the fort, because the Indians, sometimes they would not look favorably on the settlers, especially if there was some people who were venturing into the Indian encampments and stealing food from them. The Indians would retaliate and basically attack. So ultimately, there was this ongoing tension that existed between the Indians and the colonists at this point. Now, at one point, you have the development of the fort. You can see, one slide here, the inside of the fort. You can see the cannon here on another slide. There's another one where you can look inside the governor's house. These are pretty sparse accommodations. A governor's parlor. But this was all an encroachment upon the Indian area. There's a slide here of Indians praying at the river. They felt that this was their land. And on an earlier episode, I was explaining that when you are chopping down their trees, which they believe, is part of Mother Nature, but also in a very practical sense, it's the place where their fowl are nesting, and their hunting prey are being, chased from the area. So this was looked upon as an act of aggression, just simply cutting the trees down. And the Europeans didn't think much of it. But they had to build the fort. They built the houses inside the fort. They built the furniture inside the fort. So much of this effort was something that was very natural on the part of the Europeans, but very foreign to the Indians. They had different types of houses, but they also lived differently, more of a communal kind of concept to them. And the other thing, the very serious difference here between the Indians and the Europeans is that the Indians didn't really understand ownership of land. They didn't understand the concept of real estate. But the Europeans, coming out of feudal European tradition, they set up a land system similar to what the Comidia, or I can't remember how to pronounce that area in the Caribbean, that the Spaniards set up. It was a system of land ownership. And in the Jamestown colony, or what became ultimately the Virginia colony, the land ownership was very seriously designated, and they had, plotted out land so that there would be ownership, and then the farming would take place on this land if the people did the farming. So when Smith left these, people on their own, a lot of times what would happen is that there would be no food, and it would have, a serious repercussion within the Jamestown community. And so some of the people would go out and forage among the Indian areas for food. And then this would be, the Indians would be retaliating for this. Well, one of these situations occurred when Smith was away in 1607, toward the end of the year in 1607, around December. He was captured by the Pamunkeys, which is an Indian tribe there. And the Indians basically, and I think I said in a previous episode, the normal way of dealing with an enemy for the Powhatans, and the Pamunkeys were, related to the Powhatan tribe, the people would tie an individual to a tree and then, cut off the limbs and then throw the limbs into the fire and disembowel the person. However long he would survive, anyone's guess. But this was a very brutal practice. And one of Smith's people that he took up the river was captured by them, and he was killed in this manner. And the people who were guarding the canoe, they were killed as well. Smith was captured at this point. He got shot several times, and they took him prisoner. They knew the guy with this beard was the leader, and they knew him. And by reputation, or by whatever his actions were, they took Smith prisoner, and they were going to kill Smith. I'm not sure if I have that slide in this area of the Pamunkeys, but I guess I don't have it. But it's they're dancing around. They have him captured, and Smith talks his way out of it, and he demands to, see the chieftain. He meets with the chieftain, and so what's going on is that they start taking Smith and showing him off in one village after another. So, he's kind of like a celebrity. He's the captive, but many of the Indians essentially began to find Smith quite entertaining, or he would actually be able to captivate their attention in some way. So ultimately what happens is that he's taken to the village of Powhatan, who is the chief of the Powhatan people. And this is really where the story of the Pocahontas saving Captain John Smith becomes an interesting story. Smith did not record this in his history initially, and his history essentially was a compilation of notes or journals. It wasn't just all him writing this, but he had testimony that he put down, and one of the things that happened is that the chieftain was going to kill him. So and there are a lot of different pictures of the killing of Captain John Smith. But Smith was taken to the main Powhatan village, which is where Chief Powhatan was. This is where his daughter and his family, they had many wives. And, I guess there was a ceremony where they were, after taking him on his, tour around all the villages, probably they were going to just, let the chief of all the different villages determine Smith's fate. Now, there is an interesting perspective that you don't get too much in American history or U.S. history courses of the Indians. And one of the things that we discover about the Powhatans, and specifically about Chief Powhatan, because pretty much what he said was law for the Powhatan people. But at some point, he found the British a curiosity. Now, there's a story that precedes this. And we're not sure whether it was his father or not, but an individual was taken by the Jesuits, And this is earlier than the English colony. So it's when the Spaniards were in the area, taken by the Jesuits and trained and basically converted to become a Christian. And this man was then taken back to the local area where the Jamestown community was eventually founded. But at some point, the Jesuits had an encampment, a mission in this area. This guy had many wives, and the Jesuits, being religious zealots, they publicly condemned this person. Now, he obviously spoke Spanish, so he understood what they were talking about. And it became so shaming for this man that he couldn't tolerate it. And so what he did is he organized all the other Indians, and they went and destroyed the mission. They killed every last Jesuit in the mission. Now, this is preceding the Jamestown colony. It's also probably around the time of the Roanoke colony, the lost colony, or the early colonial efforts. This period is a very turbulent period. But here you have, and it's possible that Powhatan was the son of this man. And many people realized that the Powhatan people did things that way. They could easily wipe out the Jamestown community. They could have, but they didn't. The initial encampment at James Fort was just a little over 100 men, and many of them got sick. Many of them were dying. So you have how many hundreds of Indians that could have wiped this fort out? So here you have Smith, who was not respected among the leaders of the community, and he wasn't respected among just the ordinary folks who went there to work, because he was a taskmaster. The legend of John Smith said, if you don't work, you don't eat. He laid that law down because it was a survival strategy. It was the essence of this. So right now, that colony, which is struggling when Smith leaves, is about to lose the only leadership that would probably be able to hold the colony together. And ultimately, what they were going to do, they weren't going to tie him to a tree. And this is what makes the ceremony seemingly more curious. And a lot of historians, a lot of people have different opinions about, whether this was a real situation, whether he was really in danger of losing his life. But essentially, they brought out some stones, and they drug him to the stone, put his head on the stone, and they were going to be ready to just, I guess, beat his brains in, basically separate his head from the rest of his body. So this was a pretty precarious situation for Smith. He couldn't do much. And this is really where Pocahontas steps in. This is where she becomes a key individual in this effort to save his life. Now, we're going to talk later about Pocahontas because she is a key individual. She shows up as a person who is a peacemaker between the white colonists and the Indian community. Now, this is actually a demonstration that is totally devoid of racism. We can say it's racism, but my essence of reading many of these things, the essence that I have come to the conclusion of is that it was really a survival. He was surviving in this wilderness, and not just surviving on your own, but learning how to survive with other people who are completely foreign. This is a very serious situation. And the fact that Pocahontas got married to John Rolfe, not John Smith. And a lot of people, they just kind of lump these two guys. God, they're both John, right? He must have got married to, maybe they made a mistake with the last name. No, John Smith doesn't talk about a romantic relationship with Pocahontas, even though Disney Company has now taught little kids that that's the case. See, when we don't really take responsibility for our own history, what we do is we allow others to make it up. Problem is that Americans today watch TV or watch the movies and they think that's really what happened. That's history. And it happens from many different perspectives. But unless you start digging down deeply into the overall situation of a particular situation, the overall situation, and then also the specifics of the situation. So you have to look at it with, you know, not your 21st century lenses, but you have to look at it from the standpoint of, you know, these people were trying to just survive and they were doing the best that they could, which is what most people do most of the time. The actual reality is that here you have a situation where a young Indian princess, a princess, was allowed to get married to this Englishman. Right? Now, that's called interracial marriage in the 1600s. Now, if it weren't for Pocahontas saving John Smith, probably the colony wouldn't have survived until she met her future husband, John Rolfe. But she did meet her future husband. And guess what? It was John Rolfe who actually helped the colony survive because he was the one who brought tobacco seeds up from the Caribbean, the kind of tobacco that would grow and could be sold easily in England and the rest of Europe. So if you look at Pocahontas, she did an incredible thing here. But we look at the romantic relationship with Pocahontas as the main thing. No, Pocahontas was a peacemaker. Pocahontas was a person who brought two cultures together, and they allowed that to happen. This young lady, she was able to bring these two cultures together for a period of time. Now, what do we look at when we look at this? We look at the attack that the Indians made on the Jamestown colony. We don't study the peacemaking period. So we're going to talk about that. But next time, we actually are going to have William Federer, who is a real historian, who's going to come on and he's going to be talking about the aspect of slavery in Jamestown. So we're going to get to the heart of the matter next week, but I'll be revisiting the Indian situation once again because there's a lot to uncover. There's a lot to unpack here. So I hope that you learned a little bit today in the short period of time that we had. And I hope that you can rejoin us next week for William Federer, who is going to be talking about the initial slave efforts that were made in Jamestown from the 1619 point. Thank you so much, everybody. I want to thank our sponsors, and I thank all of the people who joined us today. Thank you for taking time from your busy day. Take care. We'll see you next week.